Hello, and welcome to Gothic Reviews. This is my review of the Tarot of the Dead deck by Monica Knighton. I was very intrigued by the prospect of the Tarot of the Dead, and I got it right away. And I found myself a little bit disappointed at the application. The concept was very nice. The author is saying how people are always unnecessarily afraid of death, and how she's trying to make a point, how death awaits everybody and how it's alright and it's natural and whatever else. But I think the problem is that she made the point a little bit too well, to the point where I guess I understand the point of like death being removed from the equation, but everything else as a tarot deck, it's kind of harder to use. I will present to you a few examples here of the major arcana. Here you see the card of the Fool, and it has the dog, as is common to some tarot decks. They have usually the dog or the cat with the Fool himself walking. And it's in a modern setting, which is okay. Some decks are more modern than others, but both the dog and the person are skeletal. And to make matters more interesting, they're both rushing at the same direction, which is a subtle difference from some decks where the dog is instead restraining the master from walking too carelessly in front of it, because it senses the danger that the master is oblivious to, and being reckless as is expected from the Fool. So far so good. This is not a horrible introduction, but the fact that the master is portrayed here as just a skeleton, no clothes, and so is the dog, it just empty bones, and it kind of takes away, in a sense, from the experience of the journey that a tarot deck is supposed to present. And the details here are a little bit overloaded. On one hand, they're kind of primitive to the extent that they could have been drawn by maybe a child artist. And I'm not saying that they're horrible necessarily, like I couldn't have done them myself, but the artist seems to have followed the point of the author precisely, where death is natural and everything is death, and it is basically the world of death. And it's kind of strange for me, but some people might like it. And then the next card here, the Magician. Notice how it has the traditional attributes of the Magician on the table. It has representative of all the four elements that the Magician typically controls. It has a writing desk, again placing it in a modern context. It's all well and good, except for the one little thing that it's again bone and skull and nothing else, and it's kind of... it takes the attraction out of it, it takes the subtlety of interpretation out of it. For me, at least, I find it hard to notice the contrast that I usually thrive on. And I realized, was a surprise, that many cards that I interpret on many decks, the main point about them is that the person, the querent, the one who makes the journey in the cards, has to be alive. It's important for him to be alive. How else would he feel the pain of the noose from the hanged man? How else is death even significant to him if he is not alive? The whole deck pretty much loses its meaning as a deck, as a transition from one period to another, where nothing matters. And again, it's appropriate for the world of death, because the world of death is static, nothing changes, you're always dead. And that's nice and good for the world of death, but not so much for the deck of a tarot deck that depicts a particular kind of change, a transformation, a process of growth. That's all they're known for psychologically. And if we don't see that kind of evolution, how are we to interpret the entire deck? I'm not sure. And the author does not provide real insights into it. She does have a nice booklet, and the meanings behind the cards are typical enough. But I think that her insistence on the concept a little bit takes the life out of tarot.
Would you have liked it better if it was different stages of death? If some were ghosts, some were zombies, some are skeletons, some are skeletons in different stages of decomposition, or even with clothes that had different tatters or...
Yes, that would have been nicer, because then I could see the difference, I could see the contrast, I could appreciate it as a work of art, and as a realistic transformation. But this static one, even in the card of the High Priest, for example, again, it's just a skeleton, and there is no difference from it to the skeleton of the Fool, and that's not how it's supposed to be. The Fool is supposed to grow into the High Priestess, or to grow into the Magician. And here it has a book, but what does it need a book for? It's dead. I don't understand the... Well, I mean, I understand the concept, of course, but I don't understand why the author wanted to go so hard for that particular application that worked so very well. And then again we have the card of the Empress in the seated position, and it's a natural world instead of the throne we're used to, which could be acceptable, but again, here the Empress doesn't even seem to rule anything other than maybe the natural world, so it loses its strengths to me. Then we have the Emperor, and he's in a modern setting. He has a computer screen, he has a phone receiver. It's all okay, except that what is he going to rule from this apartment when he's dead? I don't know. Maybe there are hints, but I guess I am not aware of them. And maybe one of you would be more aware of them, that's okay too, but it just seems to work strangely. And the Hierophant, again, I basically don't see the difference between the High Priest and the High Priestess. Normally the High Priestess is supposed to have the two pillars and stuff, and here instead it's the High Priest that has two vultures, which is a cute pun. Vultures are known for preying on the dead, and I understand that there's a contrast here, and there are possibilities of interpretation. This is actually one of the better cards. The only problem is that it loses its meaning as the High Priest, because it's all in the world of the dead, and there is no significance to it being High Priest or anything else. Then there is the card of the Lovers, and again, the Lovers, they have their history, they have their fights, they have their proximity, they have their marriage ceremony sometimes, but here all they have is their death, as we see from them being skulls similar to the one who is presiding over the ceremony. The only difference, of course, that the presiding over the ceremony here, the Priest of Death, apparently has some wings, which is okay, but all of that is too much unnecessary, irrelevant details. All the details in the background, they don't help me interpret. The main crucial scene of that card is also ruined because there's no distinction between lovers or between the presiding skeleton or angel, and it is harder for even experienced readers, I think, to interpret that kind of a deck. And then the next card is the Chariot, and again there are two mounts, that's traditional, but again they're skeletal, there's not even a difference between them, and normally there's supposed to be one of color, black and white, to show the contrast, the balance, all kinds of good stuff that are lacking here entirely. And then Justice here, sometimes card number 8 is supposed to be Strength instead, but Justice is okay, and of course you see here the scales, so it connects us to the Libra constellation. So then it has that attribute or the two weapons. Sometimes they could be a noose and a knife. Here they are a gun and maybe a dagger. That's all appropriate, but the whole point is that the person who is presiding over Justice is again just another skeleton with no differences from those of the predecessors. And like Morticia said, it's just very similar. It doesn't show any different stages of decomposition or anything, not a different race of the dead, nothing like that. Nothing really to work with. And the Hermit, well, I mean, why does the Hermit need isolation when he's already dead? He's already pretty isolated, I would say, in his grave. The Wheel of Fortune is supposed to represent mutability, forces at balance, but what kind of change is there to the world of the dead? So they put a butterfly over there over the wheel, which is just as appropriate as anything else. Normally they're supposed to be sharper animals, maybe dragonfly, maybe a dragon, maybe a griffin, something that can bite you to show the mutable forces at play. And here, since there's no mutability, all of that is irrelevant, so The rest of it is appropriate, but the wheel with a skeleton does not seem to be at all. And again here, the card that's supposed to be strength here, it's usually justice, but again, interchangeability is okay. Sometimes people do that in different decks. And I don't see the interplay here between strength and power. There is the half moon that might represent the instinctive forces, but it should be usually connected to the card of judgment or the moon, one of those instinctive cards, and this does not seem to be the right place for it, which would be okay in a reading if the object of strength was not just another skeleton that's not distinguished at all. And the same goes for the hangman. As I mentioned before, where is the pain? There is no transformation, no change, no insight, no perspective, because he's dead and he's just as dead as everybody else who was before. So, and now we have the card of death that is paradoxically not even named death. It is number 13, as is appropriate, and instead of death or any change or any transformation, we see here a woman, a really big woman giving birth. It is a nice concept, it's different, and having more colors, it might even be better interpreted than many others. It is, in a sense, the sum total, the whole purpose of this deck, because it shows how death is not what it seems, how it changes, but again, this concept has been applied too drastically and too intensely, so now this card that shows birth instead of death, or birth and potential, to an extent it just loses its meaning, just like the entire deck to my mind. And temperance, that usually shows liquids, and because it's supposed to be fortifying emotions for the person experiencing them, and here we have only two skeletons that might be spinning something. Hopefully it's a liquid, and maybe that's the only tribute to the tradition of Rider Waite decks, but otherwise it doesn't seem relevant at all, again because they're dead, so what kind of tests of strength are they going to experience? And the devil that offers temptations to cute little skulls. Well, slavery is understandably unpleasant, but those temptations by emotions, temptations that we have to undergo when alive, to an extent they're less present when we're dead, so again this card, just like the rest of it, is irrelevant. And I'm going to show you the rest of the cards, and the comments are always the same. It's a nice concept, the application is not so well done, because everything loses its meaning. Most of the journey we see in the tarot decks, they're supposed to be of people alive, they're not supposed to be of people dead, and that's one of the things that were positive for me. I realized that before I saw the deck, I did not realize that everybody has to be alive for the journey to have any validity, for it to have meaning, for it to have importance. It doesn't have to be stark, dark colors that I prefer. I could play with other colors too, with lesser colors, but to an extent the darker colors, the gothic tones, they accentuate the mystery, the magnificence of the journey, the difficulty of it, the struggle, the travail, and that's what all of us see in real life, I think, more so than just some kind of fatalism that we're all going to die one day and so we should prepare for it right now. I mean, I guess it's a pretty good concept, and the author even comments on it in this cute little booklet that I'm going to show you. She says how enough people ask her about death and they're afraid, and we tend to tell them metaphorically that it's transition, transformation, and she's saying that here I'm putting it in your face, it's actually death for its own sake, and we're all going to die. And all of that is true, but how many of you, my colleagues, have been doing readings for 97-year-old people who are about to die? Most of my queerants, those who ask me questions, they are very young, they're not sick, or reading a tarot question might be beyond their limits anyway. So they're relatively healthy, relatively young, they are probably not going to die. For them, it probably is going to be a transition, is going to be a change, is going to be a transformation, because that's what life is made of. And to try to make it nice is good for those who grieve, I suppose. It might help them. but it just makes death so mundane, so banal that there's no point. It's like you start surrounding yourself with death, and I don't see the point of that. I think the whole point why we even work with tarot, those of us who do, is because we want to understand life more, not to understand death more. But that's just my point of view, and of course some of you might like the deck better than I do, and I showed you enough cards. I showed you some of the ones I consider more promising. I showed you a booklet over here that does have most of it is in different languages actually, but it does have some short abbreviations for if you are just starting out. They could help you, but if you are just starting out, I would not recommend starting with this deck because it would be harder to understand the traditional system from it because it deviates from it. So I cannot keep working with the deck personally, but I understand if you do, and I hope you could find those pictures useful in such a case and my explanations of the comparison. And if you have any questions about the traditional system of the Golden Dawn as established by Rider Waite or other decks, feel free to leave it in the comments. And until then, I will depart with this mildly divided review of the Tarot of the Dead by Monica Knighton.